Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the School of Medicine Town Hall on managing stress and anxiety, reemerging from lockdown in what is our new normal. We've been under stay-at-home orders now for about 2 months, and we are starting phase 1 of the reopening, the safest at home portion of the recovery. We'll be emerging from our homes. Some of us are graduating from high school, college, grad school, or we have children who are. Businesses are opening in limited capacities, and we're all starting to think about going back to work or actually going back to work. This includes Tulane. If you have questions about what we're doing specifically to ensure the safety as you return, check out the Our Path Forward Town Hall from Monday, May 11th, which is available at medicine.tulane.edu. Today's topic involves dealing with stress and our personal wellness now that the world has changed, along with expectations of how we will behave and interact with others. The community asked for this team of panelists to return, so we brought them back to talk about the stress and isolation that comes with this new phase. So I'd like to remind you, we'll introduce everyone, remind everyone of people's expertise, but also remember to send in your questions through the chat function on Zoom or on the Facebook Live. So let me start with introductions, and we'll just have them make a round robin, but we'll start with Stacy.
Hey. Hi, I'm Stacy Drury. I am in the Department of Child Psychiatry and the Chief Research Officer for Children's Hospital.
Tonya.
Hi, I'm Tonya Hansel. I'm with the Tulane School of Social Work, and my research areas of expertise are disaster, mental health, and trauma.
Karen.
I'm Karen Weissbecker. I'm the Director of Student Support and Wellness at the medical school, serving the medical students. And I also run a master's program in genetics.
And Carrie.
I'm Carrie Weiland. I'm faculty in the psychology department uptown.
So the first question, since we had virtual graduations this weekend, I thought we'd start with graduations, and I'll direct this to Karen, but if anybody else wants to follow up with a comment, please do afterwards. So graduation is disappointing and disjointed for the class of 2020. Do you have advice on how we can make it special, deal with disappointment and feelings of people being cheated out of what they didn't get to have?
So this is personal for me. I was telling people before we got on, is just today my master's students graduated virtually, and it's a small program. I get close to them, so it's hurting me that I'm not with them. And last week my own son graduated undergrad. So I think one of the first things is to acknowledge that you're disappointed and you feel cheated and you're mad, because you don't want to ignore it. You don't want, if it's your child coming to you with that, you don't want to dismiss their feelings. They're real. And then you think about, what can we do? And of course, there's so many more creative people than me in terms of ways to celebrate on Zoom or have your parties at, socially distanced. I see it all over the internet, people doing that. One thing that I did that I had not done for my older child is I wrote him a letter, because I couldn't be with him. And so I wrote him a letter with, some whatever advice a mother can give. But I feel like that's something we may not have done in another time, and we've lost the art of letter writing. And I went back to when I dropped him off at college, what I thought of. So, the other thing to think about is you can reset another date for really doing it in person later on. And you can just recognize you will have a story to tell. Your graduation will be like no other. So think of it that way too.
So all of you have either children or students who are graduating. Does anybody else have any thoughts that you want to add on how to make the day a little more special or the weekend a little more special?
I did promise my graduating seniors, we always have a crawfish boil for the graduating seniors. And I said, it may not be crawfish season, but we will have that at some point. And I feel like at some point we'll get to the point where we have a crawfish boil we can have. We might have the table set up a little bit differently, but so just trying to find those pieces or things that might be feasible and saying that they will happen. And they might look different.
So Carrie, people are likely to be more on edge than usual. We're 2 months into this now. I think it gets increasingly difficult the longer we go through it. And even though we're sort of reopening slowly, that brings its own set of anxieties that come with it. Are there self-care techniques you can recommend?
Yeah, I think the first and most important self-care technique is to recognize those anxieties, those fears, the anger, whatever the emotions are that are coming up, the excitement. And so I think taking time and recognizing what you're feeling and that that's okay. Right? I think that there are so many emotions that we're all experiencing right now. And if we're saying, okay, I know that, there's this reopening, this is what's happening, but I'm not ready. I'm too nervous about that. That's an okay feeling. And it's okay to not be ready. It's okay to be nervous. And I think that, part of self-care is not just, hey, I'm gonna, make sure to meditate every morning, but to have an understanding of what you're feeling and why. If it takes some time to stop and journal, or come up with a, hey, this is what I'm comfortable with, and this is what I'm not comfortable with. That's an important, very important first step. And it's okay to be anxious right now, right? We don't like that feeling, but it's there for a reason. And recognizing that is, I think that's an important first step. Lots of other techniques and strategies as well, but I think that that's probably the big one.
Thanks. Stacy, our kids are hearing that the worst is over from some sources. And how do we explain things aren't quite normal yet, or that this is sort of a new normal?
So I think, again, I'm going to take this developmental lens. And I think that what you say varies on the age range that you're talking about. And so you have to think about what's most important to that age range. I'm going to start with the easiest one, which is teenagers. So if I think about what is most important to teenagers, it is their freedom. So literally in my case, it is my daughter's ability to leave my house. She does not think of this as like, doesn't have my perspective, which is like, hey, it's kind of nice. She hasn't left the house and I've gotten to see her a lot. It's been great. She doesn't share that feeling at all because she's a teenager and their brains are designed to go find their friends. And their brains are to think about all of the fun things they want to do in the future. And so for her, the approach that we have taken is to say that the lockdown, and Louisiana did a great job. So I say this to lots of people, like, we need to be very proud of our medical team, but we also need to be proud of our population and our neighbors and everybody else. If you look at our state's curve compared to everybody else's, like, we look good. And it is so rare that we get to say that as a state, we are doing something well medically. So I really emphasize that a lot. But for adolescents, the approach that I think may be helpful is to say, well, what's most important to you? Being with your friends. Great. So when do you want to be with your friends? I want to be able to go to parties. I want to be able to go to concerts. I want to be able to go to the movies. I want to be able to play on my sports team. All of those things are dependent on how well and how slowly and how effectively we reintegrate. So if people start screwing that up, your soccer season's over. Right? And so it's this idea of understanding what is most important to them. And I think that it is going to be really important to be honest, which is that we are not looking at something that July 1st, everything's better, that this is going to be a new normal, that we will find new ways to connect and to be creative about that. But I think also to think about that with our teenagers. With our little kids, I think it becomes a little bit more challenging. It is really depressing to see a playground closed. I think the caution tape around playgrounds is probably the most depressing thing I see. So then I decided that everybody should build up some sort of foundation so that everyone can have their own playground in their backyard. That doesn't really help because the playground part is really the sort of social interactions. And so I think that it is about changing the network size, right? So we can't stay socially isolated because little kids have to be around other little kids. And so we say, well, we're going to do this kind of slowly, right? We don't want to describe it as a preference, but that we're going to start with just a couple of kids and we're going to see those kids regularly, but we won't be kind of sharing toys right? So we'll be kind of doing things a little bit different. And I think that will be hard. And I think that for our little ones, there will be lots of kind of developmental concerns we're going to need to pay attention to, right? So thinking of new ways to share when you can't physically share toys is going to be a challenge. Thinking about ways that kids can learn when they won't necessarily have as much freedom to learn with physical manipulation or sort of climbing on things or climbing on things with friends. So finding those activities that can be done in parallel. And I think really we're going to have to start thinking very creatively about it. For the sort of middle-aged kids, I think we use this in another case, it's earlier access to social media stuff in a controlled way. So it's kind of like, hey, you know what COVID did? It let you get like some of that social media stuff I swore you would never get. So this idea that it is changing our norm, right? We had a policy, you didn't get like social media until, whatever age, but part of how you're going to communicate is going to be through these things. A great example of this is video games. Now, I don't want like every, 10-year-old boy feeling like they can play video games forever, but some of those video games, not Grand Theft Auto, but some of them, actually are sort of cooperative games, right? And you can talk and hang out with your friends. And, some of those games you can't even play in the same house. So while I don't want to advocate for huge amounts of video game time, this idea that we already have some of these tools that allow children of different ages to interact. So one of my friends has an 11-year-old boy, and they set up a 45-minute time where all the boys get on and they play video games together. So it's their time. They've all got like the headphones that cancel out their parents, so you can't yell and tell them to come to dinner. But they think it's really cool. And so this idea of leveraging things that we might not have used in a different way. But I do think that it is going to be important to, from now on, say that this is going to be a slow thing, and that's going to be 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and to anticipate that this isn't like the dam is open, and to have those conversations with every age group. Because you don't want to set an unrealistic expectation and then have to crush little kids' dreams again and again. I mean, I do that as a doctor, but you don't really want to do that as like a parent. So,
Tonya, the recovery from a pandemic is different than anything New Orleans has experienced in the past. This time, it's not just us; it's people all over the world. Can you comment on sort of how this makes it, or if it makes it different?
Yeah, I think that kind of global connectedness that you see, and kind of understanding what people in areas maybe you've never even been to are going through because you're experiencing it as well. I think that can be a really powerful thing. And I don't think we really know how that's going to impact how we recover and the outcomes that we're going to see from COVID. But I think we are seeing that the recovery process and kind of this phases of recovery that we go through are pretty similar to what we've seen in some of the past recovery. We've kind of gone through the response and heroism. We all managed to kind of help reduce the number of cases and reduce impact, which once I want to, kind of echo my co-presenters that, this is an amazing stride that we have accomplished. And then we're going to move into that social collectivism. So we're still going to be on a high, but that doesn't mean that, in a month, in 3 months, we're really going to see some of that disillusionment phase that we've seen past all types of disasters, where that reality, that new normal, and the negatives that may come along with that new normal are going to set in. So we do need to be cautious about those long-term outcomes.
Karen, so if somebody has a daughter or son or daughter who's accepted to the Tulane School of Medicine, and they'll be starting in a few months, people have a feeling this experience might be different than it was the entering class, what their expectations were last year. What advice do you have?
I think it's obvious that it's not going to be the same. I mean, how could it be, right? The school is working hard to try and figure out what is this going to look like. Planning for plan A, We can have some in person, maybe more online, plan B where it's going to be totally online or whatever it is. And I think that that in itself is a good lesson, is that when you come in, you've got to think about in life, what's my plan B? You have certain expectations, but having a plan B, I think, is just, you know, being able to be flexible. Med students are usually very driven. They have a path. This is what I need to do to get to my next, you know, thing I need to get to. And it's very hard for them to sort of recognize there's maybe more than one way to get where you want to go. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind, is like, the other thing is with every year, I have to have my students realize that we are pass-fail for a reason, so that it takes an adjustment. And every year I tell them, most of you are at the top of your class. Only 10% of you will still be at the top 10% of your class. And probably none of you are in the bottom 10% of your class, but 10% of you will be the bottom. They have to go in, and that's every year, this year as well as every year. So again, what are your expectations? And the third thing is that the school is trying to pay attention to how are we going to build community? Because community is a big thing in any school, going into undergrad, going to med school, making your friends over, you know, in your anatomy lab or whatever. So we're trying to come up with new ideas on building community, even if some of us is still online. So we have like learning communities. We're trying to revamp them for this. So you're going to have to make that extra effort perhaps to find your people. It might be a little bit different, but you know, it's going to be one step at a time, and you know, you can do this, and go easy on yourself. And almost everybody coming to med school, again, not different this year than any other year, is going to always feel like, you know, the imposter syndrome. Like, oh gosh, look, everyone else is so smart. That's not going to change. Some things don't change.
Carrie, I love this question because I hear it a lot. So people go back to work and they have a coworker who won't wear a face covering, and people aren't socially distancing properly. What's the best way to approach them? Are there techniques that we can use that aren't angry?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that, you know, in some ways it's easier to say what not to do than what to do. And you mentioned anger. I think that, you know, we might see someone approaching things differently. And if it's, hey, they're not wearing a face mask when they're supposed to be, or they're too close together, and I'm angry, I'm upset, I'm anxious, and I want to lash out. So I think first checking that, and maybe you have a right to be angry. Maybe someone isn't taking proper precautions, right? And that anger is okay, but lashing out at someone is not going to get anyone anywhere. At this point, I think there is a lot of tension. I've seen things, you know, people are blasting people and posting pictures on social media. Look at these people. They're too close together. They're having a party. And that is not an approach that's going to be a productive way to handle things. It's just going to, you know, create more anger. So I think that, you know, finding communication's really important right now. And if you can communicate and think about ways to, you know, A, calm your anger down, B, think about what might be someone else feeling. And maybe you're on the other side. Maybe you're like, you know what, I'm okay. I feel like we're 6 feet apart. I don't need a mask. And someone else is saying, I want to wear a mask, right? And so recognizing that, again, people have different levels of anxiety and approach, and saying, you know, here's how I feel, not an accusatory communication. I think that kind of coming to it with this, you know, perspective of other people have different feelings, you know, other people might not have read the same articles as you read, and they're feeling very differently about it. Now, that being said, I think if anyone feels unsafe in their environment or with their interactions, you know, it's a lot harder in a work environment than a social environment. Social environment, you can say, hey, I'm not comfortable with this interaction going this way. At work, you know, if you can best communicate with that person in the same kind of like, hey, this is what I'm comfortable with. I'm going to close my office door, you know, starting with that. But I think that one of the key things that we need to start with is not what we need to not do, right? If you're going and gossiping to all your coworkers and sending pictures of, hey, so-and-so wasn't wearing a mask. Can you believe that? That is oftentimes, I think, what we kind of want to do first, but is not going to get you anywhere.
Tonya, people in New Orleans, we tend to be a city of extremes in our emotions. Like when things are good, we're the best city in the world, and otherwise we think there's just a cloud of like, you know, doom following us around. So we're in this pandemic, and we know they're going to start taking down Hard Rock soon, and then hurricane season is coming. And we keep hearing it's going to be busy, and it's like and last night there was flooding in some parts of the city, so people feel like they can't catch a break. How do we deal with the idea that we feel like disaster always seems to be hanging over our heads?
Yeah, I mean, and that's a very real concern that we're all experiencing. And if we look at this as kind of a cumulative disaster response, I think that kind of helps to understand where you might have some triggers, where it might not even be completely related, but kind of like a large flood following Katrina may have kind of re-triggered some of those same emotions that you had following Hurricane Katrina. We might have that same situation here with COVID, and they might not be similarly related, but kind of knowing yourself and knowing how you react to stress or when your stress is too much are going to be really important things, because even though we are constantly exposed, we kind of understand disaster preparedness better than many places. We still need to look at that these happen over time. We have overcome and came back from some horrendous events. And I have no doubt that we're going to do this again. The most important thing is to realize that we can't necessarily control anything, but, on the larger scale. But what we can do is make sure that we're practicing social distancing, wearing our masks, avoiding repetitive news outlets, and making sure that we're prepared for the upcoming hurricane season, so that if something like this does happen, that we've controlled as much as we can in this situation.
I'm not actually sure who this question should go to, so I'm going to ask it and have a couple of you jump in. It just came to me. I'm super stressed about the ability to send my kids back to daycare and school in the fall. Class sizes are going to be reduced, as will hours. I've heard there'll be 1 week on and 1 week off for elementary school. How do I possibly work during this time?
So I can start with this a little bit. So I think one thing that I have heard now is that this is a moving target. And that I have now heard like several different schools have decided and no one's really decided. So the first thing that I want to say is to sort of, to some extent, think about it for the school year, but to another extent, not focus on it because it is a moving target. And it can be really distressing to come up with a very clear plan for something, and then it gets completely shifted and changed. And so I know that we would all love to have something that we can control and to have a plan for that control. And clearly there are definitely good reasons to want your child to go to school and be out of your house, and for you to be out of your house and to be like, yes, they are going out of the house for 10 hours or 8 hours a day. Dear God, they have to go, right? So there's a big, that makes sense. And you're a good parent if you want your child to go out of the house. You're not a bad parent if you really want your child to be in the house. Yeah. So one is to sort of understand that this is a moving target. I think another is to sort of build your network, right? So we have various sizes of networks and of people who think like us. And I don't know if it was Carrie or Tonya that said this, but we all have groups of people that think or share our same levels of concerns or worries or fears about everything that relates to caregiving in childhood. And so to think about your network and start to identify the families where your kid goes to school or who your child hangs out with that think or share your same views. And I am being very careful in my words because I don't want to say that there are views that are better or worse, right? There are levels of tolerance that different people have. And I think one way to think about this restructuring of our social networks, because by their very nature, they're going to be smaller, is to try to think think about the social network that you build as being the families and parents and kids that share your same tolerance level, right? So if it is going to be a week on and a week off, is there a family that it has your same level of concern, right? And again, I'm not putting a valence on it, but to build your network in a way that you're not going to be trying to set, like if you have a very, like you're very protective, right? Versus you're kind of like, I think we're going to be okay. Don't mix those. Try to find people that share that with you to say, hey, you know, we don't know if it's going to be a week on, a week off. Can we start to think about an idea? Or, you know, I've heard that it could be half the class goes on one day, half the class goes on another day, which would be super confusing. And I would definitely send my kid to school on the wrong day. But to start thinking about who would be within your child's network, the people that you could share the same level of concern. And I think it's okay to ask, right? This communication thing is really, really going to be important, which is we may not know about someone's own medical status or their spouse's medical status, or their kid maybe has some sort of immune disorder, or they have a sick relative that they take care of, right? So all of our risk factors may be different. But to say, you know, hey, this is kind of where I sit, and where do you sit, and how, you know, is that a good fit, would be one of my suggestions as we plan for, as we try to build structure in a very unpredictable future.
We have another question from the audience. Carrie. My mom, who does not usually share, I guess I should wear my glasses when I'm actually trying to read. My mom, who usually doesn't share her feelings, has commented she's struggling with not being able to pick up her grandkids and hug them. How can we help her?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that so many people are struggling when they're disconnected from family members, and, you know, family members with children, grandparents that are used to a lot of physical connection. I think kind of going back to what Karen was saying about graduation, and creative ways to connect, is one start, right? A lot of people are doing drive-bys, and again, it's kind of managing what level of comfort it is. Is it sitting out in the yard with your chairs apart? Some people are comfortable with that, some people are not. Some people are coming up to windows, right? So that you can actually, you know, put your hand against the window. And it is going to be hard, and acknowledging that, yeah, it totally sucks, you know, if you can't hug people and hug kids that you're used to hugging. And, you know, I think that acknowledging it, that's sucky, and that's really, really, really hard. And I think that prior to this, people probably didn't realize how hard that would be, right? Because it's not necessarily a salient, like if I couldn't hug someone, like I might not be thinking about that every day, but then it's taken away and it is a challenge. So I think that, you know, just acknowledging how hard that is for everyone, you know, the kids as well. And then, you know, what are ways that we can kind of creatively connect is helpful. I also think that, you know, one of the struggles people might be having is, hey, it's reopening. Does this mean we can all start hugging again? And, you know, maybe we want to, again, that kind of go slowly. And how do we, you know, communicate with everyone, not just the kids, but how do we go slowly about that? So.
Karen, let's say I have, I'm a graduating student, and I was so excited. I had a job offer, but because of the pandemic, that offer has gone away. What advice do you have to help me focus on moving ahead?
This is a hard one. Again, I'm getting a little repetitious, but again, acknowledge the anger and frustration of this. You know, we keep talking about the new normal, and it's really not. It's a new abnormal. There's nothing normal about this. But the other thing is to go ahead, and you're gonna have to try and find a plan B. And mostly we're talking people who don't realize how young they are. Those of us who've been around for a bit, and how much of life there still is. And other times in life, you get thrown these curveballs, or there's a fork in the road and you thought you were going down one way and there's a roadblock. You got to go the other way. So you're going to have to slowly take what comes with the idea of this is not forever. And every experience I'm going to have, whether it's not the perfect job I wanted, but it's at least gives me a little bit of money, I might have to go that route, you know, find that plan B. The other thought I had, which just left my mind, was related to, was that I saw a thing in the Wall Street Journal where it said class of 2020 walking into a hurricane. And they were talking about the job market that was going away. And it struck me so much because we are all Hurricane Katrina survivors, or most people from New Orleans are. And it kind of struck me, especially for my graduate, that dang, those hurricanes keep hitting our kids. But one thing we learned from having gone through those is that we do get to the other side. It may not be what we thought, but we do survive them. And we have to remember that part of it, that there will be another side to this hurricane. We'll get through it. I don't know how helpful that is, but that's a way to kind of think about it.
Stacy, my kids are terrified to be around people who haven't been near them for the last couple of months because we've been, you know, there's all this news about the virus. They're worried they might get sick. What do I say to help ease their fears?
Well, I'm going to steal from Karen. So first, validate, right? So yeah, it's scary. And I think then it comes to trying to hear from them what they're scared of, right? So what is the source of the fear as best as possible, and to do it very concretely. So if you see this person, what do you think might happen? And what is that concrete thing? And again, I think there's a developmental piece to this, right? So how concrete you are depends on the age. So you want to be very specific with little kids, right? About what we know, and clearly, you know, what we don't know about transmission. I think, so one thing is to see if you can understand or have them be specific about what part of seeing a new person or seeing a person is making them scared, right? And also to bring into that idea, what would be good about seeing that person, right? So why would I want to make you scared like that? And see if you can sort of reach into this idea of, well, we haven't seen them for a long time, for a while, but is there something good about seeing them? Is there something that might be fun? I think the other thing is to sort of steal something from pharmacology, which is to start low and go slow. So it's probably not a great idea to take a kid who's a little anxious and say, hey, let's go see 20 of your closest friends, you know, in this tiny little house. But to really sort of build this idea of what would be a low level exposure, right? And maybe we could go sit with them outside somewhere before it gets to be 1,000 degrees. Or maybe we could think of, yeah, so we better start soon, guys. Just saying, it's going to get really too hot to be outside. Everybody build some fans outside. But sort of this idea of starting low and going slow. And then if things go well, right? So if you stay healthy, right? So, hey, that was pretty good. What were the good things about it? And we did okay. So building that. I think you can also sort of start with this idea of who might be the safest kid to go hang out with, right? And so even little kids, they know which moms are the most obsessive with hand washing and which kids pick their nose. So maybe if your kid has a friend that picks their nose a lot, maybe that's not the one to start with, right? So start with the one that, just, once you figure out what their fear is, you guys are all laughing because you know that that kid that picks their nose that was friends with your kid, you know which one I'm talking about. So that's probably not the best one to start with. We don't want to do the deep dive into the massive exposure. And also going back to, I think, what Carrie and Tonya also said, which is own your own anxiety. So if you're anxious about seeing or going to a place and your kid is anxious about going to a place, that's probably really not a good starting point. And then there's also a bunch of really good books and coloring books and stuff out there that talk about it. So I would recommend that as well.
I always feel like when I ask you a question that's designed for children, that it's really just a cover for things adults are afraid to ask. Because they're all the same. We all seem to have the same.
I do think you guys should all be willing to ask your friends if they pick their noses. I think that should be like our new thing.
I think you're using that as code for something else, and we all know what.
No, I still think I want to know who picks their nose, and I think I might have them a little bit more distant.
Tonya, this is a question we got from one of our audience members. What if you're claustrophobic and the mask enhances that feeling and you feel like you can't breathe? We're all supposed to go back to work. We're all supposed to be masking. How do we handle that?
That's, there are different ways that you can help kind of minimize that reaction that you're having. And that would be just kind of using your positive coping mechanisms. Some of the self-care that Carrie mentioned earlier would be a good way to kind of minimize your reaction that you're having to avoid that mask. And all masks are not created equal. And some that some people like are better than others. They have more breathability. There's some really good information online about kind of what kind of fabric you want to look for or what kind of components you want to look for, and making sure that you get one that's going to work with you and that you're going to feel comfortable wearing, because then you're more likely to wear them.
I answered that question a little bit online too. The other way to think about it is sort of the way we do what sometimes called exposure therapy. Start for a little bit, acknowledge that feeling of I can't breathe, but there's always probably another voice in your head saying, okay, I can breathe, and start listening to, that may be very quiet at the beginning, but start listening to the, okay, I had it on for 5 minutes and I did okay. And then the next day, maybe 10 minutes, that kind of thing, so that you do your own kind of positive feedback of, yeah, I got through that.
That's a great idea.
I would also say do some like creative things. Like if you have like, turns out you can put like essential oils on these masks. So if there's like, we did just watch Seinfeld, so I'm going to say like the ocean smell. But so things that like smell like things that make you happy or sort of those kind of things. And then the practicing part.
There is the mask I saw that you can put a straw through, but I'm not sure that public health officials would approve of that one. So this one just came in as well, so I'm just going to address it to all of you. My wife's company wants to mandate an immediate rush to complete normalcy, being fully operational and everyone present in person while childcare programs are still closed. Are there psychological tools you can advise to employ in approaching employers and how to reach a compromise? Karen? There's no one jumping in. I'm just going to be like,
I didn't catch the very last part of the question. You kind of went out, and so that's why I'm just kind of staring at you.
Are there tools that we can use? How to advise someone to talk to their employer about a situation like this?
That's a very good question. Like, how do you talk to them, right? So I think this is National Mental Health Awareness Month. And one of the sayings for it is stop the stigma. So it is a problem in terms of you want to somehow be able to work with your employer, but everyone's going to be afraid that they're going to be stigmatized for bringing it up. A way to bring it up is a way that, as I said, sort of how do we solve this problem together? So this is something I'm having a little bit of a problem with. Maybe even come with some of your own solutions or reasonable ones and things like that to make it a conversation with your employer. But I know that's really tough sometimes, especially if there's a hierarchy there. You don't want to be admitting what might be construed as weakness, but having a realistic concern is not weakness. Like being able to ask for support and ask for let's work out this problem together is a strength, but doesn't always feel like it. But start a conversation. I guess that's the best way I can think of it.
So one thing I would add to that is to have an idea of various levels of solutions. So I think have like your ideal, like this is, if I get this, I've been super successful. And then have a sort of acceptable and maybe a solution in the middle. Because, every employer is going to have goals that they want to reach, right? And so being aware when you go into that conversation of your employer's goals and aligning your requests as much as possible with those goals, but also coming in with some options or solutions. So I think it's really, they're going to be getting, and I don't know who they is, but employers will likely be getting a lot of different requests, right? And they're supposed to be not just the employer, but the master solver of all problems. And so I think coming from a position where you have thought through their perspective and can acknowledge that you have thought about what the goals are of your employer and how this may not perfectly align, but is sort of a middle ground, and having those options in hand that you are already comfortable with, and thinking about it as a negotiation can also be really helpful.
Sort of along those same lines, Carrie, a lot of us or a lot of our friends are, if not afraid to go back to work, at least anxious about it. Or there are ways or tools that we can use to help us get through that anxiety?
Yeah, and again, reiterating what I and Karen and what everyone has said earlier, like acknowledging that. I think kind of sitting down and, this is a hard time for people with anxiety because planning and, knowing what to expect is sort of taken off the table a little bit. But to the extent that you can sit down and say, okay, these are the things that I'm comfortable with. This is what's going to make me more or less comfortable, and kind of come up with a plan for how you are going to use what tools you have that make you comfortable, for your social interactions, for going back to work, thinking about ways you can create your space, right? So, I have an office that I almost never close my door because I don't have a window, but it might be, okay, I'm going to have my door closed. Or to communicate to your colleagues, like, I'm okay with, this kind of interaction, but not this, right? So kind of coming up with a plan for how you're going to approach, and what you have control over, right? So I think that that's a hard one because there are a lot of things we don't have control over. So if we can think about what are the things that I do have control over, I think that, hopefully many companies are still having some flexibility, right? So if there are anxieties of going back to work, childcare issues, saying, okay, what can I do remotely, right? And so instead of thinking, okay, well, we're reopening and I got to jump back in, if there are options for, hey, I'll Zoom in and I'll do things more remotely, then take those options, right? It's not a cop-out. It is an opportunity to be able to control the situations. I think that that's probably, thinking about it, writing things down, that helps a lot to come up with a plan, and a schedule and a routine, through those practices.
And I would add, be patient with yourself and with your colleagues and the people around, because if you remember, I don't even know how many weeks ago it was, 6-8 weeks ago, I felt like, oh, I got to just now switch everything to home and Zoom and do it on Zoom. It took a while to get the hang of it and get a new routine and get a new, structure to my day. As we slowly reopen, it's not going to go straight back to what we knew. It's going to be yet another adjustment. A transition is hard, even when it's to a positive thing, moving to a new house or, getting married. So be patient with yourself and try this out one day, adjust the next day, and within a few weeks, you'll get back in your new routine, I think.
Stacy, the next question builds on something that you mentioned earlier. I have a teen and a tween. I am simultaneously trying to make sure the world doesn't revolve around their phone and also relax my views on social media or platforms during this time because it gives them an opportunity to socialize, as you mentioned. What should be my guiding principles on what is enough and what is too much?
Okay, so that's tricky. So I think that is gonna vary, right? And it's a wobbly line. And I think it is going to, I don't know. No, I'm going to try to give a good solid answer, but acknowledge that there isn't a set number, I mean, I will say that like the American Academy of Pediatrics clearly has set numbers of hours. I think one way, if your kiddo has one of those screen time trackers that you could do to sort of get an idea, is to say, hey, I'll let you do this for a week if you don't have anything else to do. And let's look at your moods on the days. So to track your mood on the day and look at the number of hours, and then go back at the end of the week and take a look. And my bet is that the more time that they sort of spend isolated kind of on their social media, their moods are not necessarily always going to be better. And to sort of think about this connection between your social media and your screen time, and maybe looking at the days and say, well, on this day, what did you do? And do you think that was related to your mood? I do think that this is going to be a new abnormal, to use Karen's words, which is that because we can't allow, or we won't be able to allow those bigger social interactions or those other things that are actually really critical for social emotional development. But I would also say that I would throw in some caveats, right? So that this doesn't mean that the nighttime turning off your phone and moving away from screen time should go away. So throughout all of this, maintaining routines and sleep-wake cycles is really important. So for kids, this means that, and I think everybody has a different age when they do this, but to be in charge of taking that phone out of the room at night. And if they do have more social media time, then maybe they have to be sitting in a common area, right? So that this isn't a socially isolating activity, and that they're still sort of like, okay, fine, if you want an extra hour of time on your phone, you have to be going for a walk. So setting these kind of caveats to it, right? So you don't get to sit in a dark room on your social media for 8 hours a day. We are going to still take it away so you go to bed at night. And potentially sort of linking it to sort of what your moods are like. So are you using that and not doing things that make you feel better? Potentially linking it to good activities, right? So, okay, you want some more screen time, let's do laundry. So, you can potentially think about it in those standpoints, but I do think there are limits, right? And that really keeping some of those things so that there are moments. So no phones at dinner, no social media. If we have a family thing that we're doing, like everybody puts away phones, which I think is super important, so that we don't lose those. Just because we're physically distancing doesn't mean that you can always be locked into your social media. And then model it yourself, like do that too.
I would add one thing about social media. Sorry, but I think that we have to also think about not all screen time, not all social media is created equal. And so, and this is for kids, adults, right? If you're on social media and you're connecting with people, you're chatting, you're texting, for all of us, that's a way to stay connected. I mean, I've seen some really positive things on social media that have been uplifting and heartwarming. But there are other things that happen. If you're following a bunch of celebrities and feeling crummy about yourself, whatever age you are, right? Or if you're doing things that are having that negative mood effects, I think like what Stacy was saying, like what are ways that we can manage how we're using it, not just how much, for everyone, I think is really important to think about.
Tonya, can you comment on the notion that there is the possibility of a bigger disaster, COVID burden in the fall? How do we prepare mentally when we won't have really recovered from this wave yet?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a very real fear that we should all have. And, fear doesn't have to be a bad thing. Fear can be oh my goodness, I really hope this doesn't happen. I'm going to prepare and make sure that I'm ready, even if they have to be flexible plans, even if it's something that you can't guarantee 100% that this is going to be your plan. A lot of these models are also based on very old data. So we don't know 100% if that's going to even be the case. We should be prepared for it, kind of as the worst case scenario, and be willing to social distance again and be having these more restrictive patterns of movement. But at the same time, we don't know that this is going to happen. We should plan for it, and we should hope and really be quite happy if we can get through this kind of critical flu season, September, October, November, without that second wave. There will probably be a definitely a rise in cases, but hopefully we can, through social distancing, which we realize that we can do, and we can do very effectively, that we can minimize that, and so it won't be as kind of dire as many people are proposing that it could be. But that's not to say that we should minimize that threat and that potential either, that we need to be mindful that that could be possible, but that it's not a certainty at this point.
Sorry.
I just want to put in a random plug. So one of the great things about Tulane in particular is our expertise in infectious disease. And so one of the things that we have that very few other places have at this level is the research that is ongoing. So I think as we think about active things that we can do to help manage, prevent, or mitigate the intensity of these future, if we do get a spike in the fall, part of that is really saying, what can we do? Can we participate in some of the research that's going on? So I think active participation in saying, can I help the scientists get the data that they need to get better numbers? And it's going to be a lot easier at Tulane just because we have it happening here. And so I would say that part of this is trying to make sure that we are doing what we can to make sure that the people making these decisions have the information. And we have some great infectious disease and science people here. And I think we're ideally positioned as a community to actively support that and help us have the numbers and the information that we need to know what we need to do to best protect us moving forward.
So Stacy, staying with you, this is an interesting question. Are there any developmental concerns we should be aware of since our 10-week-old has only been around mom and dad? We want her to be adaptable and not scared of other family members.
Yeah. So this is I feel like Karen, like this is a tough one. This is the thing that, so I am obsessed with babies. I love everything about them. And this is a really difficult question to answer because babies learn, grow, and thrive absolutely through social interactions. And I think, there are things that I do worry about. So, I have a lot of worries about social emotional development with kids only seeing other people with masks, right? So the way that kids learn that other people have emotions is to see them on their faces. And so we're going to have a group of kids of various ages that are going to have this exposure gap. And so I do actually worry about social emotional development. I do worry with little kids in particular about sort of, are we going to give them the sort of freedom to roll around in different environments and textures? I'm devastated right now that the Children's Museum is not available because there's so much sensory and wonderful things there that are so critical to all aspects of brain development and child development. So I am anxious and I would love to play with all babies and give them lots of the social stimulation that they need. I would say to really think about ways to make sure that kids are having these type of interactions. It's going to be very much with a smaller group of people, so it's a dose kind of perception. But it is important to think about the fact that not being able to physically touch as many things, not being able to physically manipulate as many things, or, pull a toy away from your peer at, daycare. Those are going to be things that we need to develop new ways of dealing with. And I do think that every parent, grandparent, teacher has to think about ways that we can convey emotional information effectively. With a mask. So in theory, I would love some really smart person in one of our biomedical engineering places to develop clear masks so that we can actually have facial motions, and then we could get Amazon to patent them and make millions. Or I wouldn't make millions, we would just make masks. But I think that idea is really, really important, and I don't want to underestimate how important time with seeing actual faces and facial emotional expressions is. I think we may want to focus on sort of auditory stimulations, like thinking of other sensory systems that we can use. So maybe being more extreme cooking to really work on the olfactory system, but to recognize that these feed in together, and that you are going to be, if you have a kid, probably under the age of 24, this idea that their brains are still plastic and developing, and that these types of shifts in social stimulation and the environment in which they live will influence brain development is really important. Jay Geed has some amazing data looking at even just sort of the ability to multitask as we have shifted and given kids phones. Like, there's changes in brain structure because of this. And I think it is going to be important to really be thoughtful of that. But I am all about somebody designing these clear masks so that we can, our kids can become the, you know, the super genius smart ones.
I'm sort of surprised that it hasn't been done yet, actually.
Yeah, this is not my area of expertise. So this is me as mom. One thing that I have to pull up, the geneticist side of me, is that there's nature and there's nurture. And there was one study about the good enough mom, so that kids are a lot more resilient than we think. So as you know, we worry about them, but you think about when a kid falls down and gets a boo-boo, how fast they repair compared to us when we get a bruise now at our age. So we also have to hope that their brains may develop slightly differently, but they are resilient, and you know, they'll find a way.
So we're almost out of time. We've got about 4 or 5 minutes left. I'm not going to ask the question I asked like the last time, which is what keeps you up at night, because we're moving into a more hopeful phase than we were the last time we talked. So, but I'd like to hear sort of like just some closing thoughts and tips that you guys have as we move into recovery. We'll start with this side of my screen. We'll start with Karen.
Gosh, again, I think the big thing is be patient with yourself and those people around you. Be compassionate with yourself and those people around you, because we're going through yet another transition. And take it, you know, you're going to have to do it one day at a time. I think that's the best way to do it.
Carrie?
I agree with that completely. And I would add, yeah, the compassion, the empathy, the perspective taking for others, right? So self-care, but also thinking about how other people are feeling is going to be really important. And I also think that if we can think about our time in isolation as what were the positives, you know, even if it's something simple as like, wow, I have nailed Zoom and I'm feeling really good about that, right? So like thinking about that and going forward with like, okay, well, maybe this is something I can utilize, right? Whatever that looks like for you. And I think that that will help with the transition as well, right? Instead of just being like, okay, I'm done with that awful stuff. Like, okay, there was some good in that.
Tonya?
Well, if you would have told me back in January that this was going to be my future through May, I think I probably would have said, this is ridiculous. There's no way we can shut everything down. We can shut schools down. But we did it. And for the most part, pretty successfully. You know, there's definitely hiccups. So that gives me hope, a lot of hope actually, that whatever the next few months throw at us, that we are also going to be able to adjust, to be flexible, and to figure out ways that we can be successful for whatever the future brings us.
Stacy, any tips for parents as we start moving into phase one?
Well, this is developmental. So for all of you parents of teenagers, think of how many weeks you didn't have to fight about whether or not your kid was going to go to a party. So keep that in mind. That's your positive for that. And that you got to spend more time with them. I think this is a roller coaster. And for anybody who has been a parent for even half a second, it's a roller coaster. And this is a different type of challenge than we then we came in that playbook, which we all got when we became parents, right? Oh wait, we didn't get a playbook. So this is about that same thing. And I think there will be memories that are challenging. And, you know, the hope is to really try to say, what might be something that came out of this that will make us different, and how can that different be something that moves us forward? You know, and we, for those of us who lived here for Katrina, we have those moments, right? There are things that we never thought we would do, or things that we never learned. Like I learned, don't mix dog food and diaper genies in any place that might get water. But I think that you should really, for many of us, we have been through this, and that story has bright spots in it, really frustrating spots, but bright spots, and to say that we will likely end up at that place again.
Thank all of you for joining us. I think a few of you have some extra materials that people can access for tips on self-care and other issues. So as always, this town hall has been recorded and will be available on the YouTube channel, the School of Medicine Facebook page, and on medicine.tulane.edu. So those documents, people can find those tips there. Thanks again. Everyone have a great weekend, and we will see you next week.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.